Pay close attention. What you're about to see is Bible prophecy being fulfilled.
Welcome to another edition of YPN News, bringing you news as it relates to Bible prophecy and foretold by Israel Hawkins. Well, Jeff, we've got that pesky bird flu is yet again once on the rise. Of course, COVID cases, well, we started to see a downturn in them, but hospitals are starting to see that number climb once again, and more on the war in Ukraine because, of course, that is ongoing. But first, we're going to start out with the approaching Easter Sunday coming up. Some people are noticing both a shortage and price increase of eggs. Well, that shortage is caused by surging cases of bird flu, which has wiped out more than 19 million egg-laying chickens on commercial U.S. farms this year, and the worst outbreak since 2015. Well, that is according to the federal and state data. Well, France also is suffering with 8% of its laying hens being culled due to the virus as well.
Well, during the spring of the year, the demand for eggs jump as people use more eggs during Passover, the Easter bake, and dye eggs for the holidays. Now, farmers say that it will take months for prices to come down, as it will take that long for operations to get back to normal. The president at Iowa's second largest egg producing facility told Reuters News that the whole industry is in a general panic. Now, wholesale prices for eggs in the U.S. Midwest are up nearly 200% from a year earlier.
Wow. Well, as a result, consumers could see higher prices for foods made with eggs, such as mayonnaise. Well, the war in Ukraine is also disrupting egg distribution for places like the Middle East, with Ukraine being now the EU's largest egg producers. Other countries such as Turkey are now being considered to fill that gap.
Well, the war in Ukraine has put a bottleneck in global food and fuel supplies, and as a result, there are surges in food prices coupled with shortages, which could contribute to 1.7 billion people going hungry. Now, Russia and Ukraine grow much of the wheat, barley, maize, and sunflower oil that developing nations depend on. Global oil and gas prices are up as well as countries limit transactions with Russia. Now, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres said the war is supercharging a three-dimensional crisis: food, energy, and finances that is pummeling some of the world's most vulnerable people, countries, and economies.
That's right. Well, Russia and Ukraine produce almost 30%, or about 30%, of the world's wheat and barley, including some of the poorest who get their wheat from those two countries. Well, food prices are up by 34% compared to this time last year, and that's the highest level ever recorded by the UN Food and Agriculture Organization. Crude oil prices have risen as well by 60%, as many of us have seen at the pump, compared to this time last year. And they also export, that is Russia and Ukraine, in addition to these things, more than 1/5 of the world's fertilizers. And of course, keeping with the trend, those prices have doubled.
Well, more disturbing news for many, as the consumer price index was on average 8.5% higher than it was just a year ago. And that is the highest rate of inflation since 1981. Now, food prices are up 8.8%, energy prices up 32%. Now, these prices recorded since the first full month of the war in Ukraine started. Now, even though economists blame Putin for the increases, many of these prices started rising before the war began. And even before these numbers came out, more than almost 70% of Americans disapprove Biden's handling of inflation, while 66% say that the higher prices have been difficult or a hardship.
In an attempt to reduce gas prices, the EPA is going to approve the sale of a special gas blend of fuel or gasoline mixed with 15% ethanol known as E15. Well, E15 is normally sold in the summer months because of concern for higher gas prices. E15 is a big deal, though, in Iowa, which is the nation's biggest ethanol producing state.
Well, in Shanghai, China, as the lockdowns there continue, citizens have taken to the streets in protests, complaining about restrictions on their freedoms, lack of access to foods and essential resources for the elderly. Now, China was going to lift the lockdown on Monday, but more than 25 million citizens have been told to remain in their homes until their city has been cleared of all positive cases. Now, China stands strong on their COVID protocols and taking a very hard stance there against the COVID-19 and keeping people locked down until they can so-called be COVID-free.
Yeah, 25 million people. That's a feat just to keep that amount of people inside for that long of a time. Well, Liang Wanyan of the COVID-19 Response Task Force expert panel said, quote, "The dynamic zero COVID policy does not seek zero infections. It aims to discover and halt infections to prevent large-scale resurgence. This is a scientific approach, and if we can make good of use of it, he said, we can get the maximum benefit with the minimum cost," end quote. But the costs, of course, are mounting as many of the hastily built facilities that were set up to house positive COVID cases are in disrepair. Some with mild and even no symptoms are housed together in those kind of broken down facilities with those who are more severely ill.
Well, one woman in Shanghai counts herself lucky. She said that she was able to buy enough food for her and her father before the lockdowns occurred, but says others were caught off guard.
Well, we're going to turn it over to our field correspondent, Larry McGee, who has more on the continuing rise in COVID, as we mentioned at the very beginning of the broadcast, some clashes that are taking place in Jerusalem, and more on this Biden's plan to give more military aid to Ukraine, and there's a lot of other countries that are contributing as well. Larry, what do you have for us?
The plague is continuing to mutate and rage on, with over 80 million people reported to have been infected in the U.S. alone. And the new subvariant of the Omicron mutation is quickly pushing those numbers upward. Palestinians are pushing back at Israeli police, resulting in over 150 being injured so far as tensions boil over on the Temple Mount. Israeli police are said to have stormed Al-Aqsa Mosque and searched for two men who were allegedly responsible for shooting off fireworks and throwing stones. Close to 40 people have lost their lives as a result of the fighting so far. The United States has pledged to contribute $800 million to Ukraine's fight, which includes pallet loads of Javelin missiles that are said to be destroying Russian armored vehicles. NATO is also working very closely with Ukrainian personnel to get weapons into the hands of soldiers. When pushed on the question, top NATO brass state that they are not only in the war between Russia and Ukraine, but they are also in it to win. Concerning the war itself, President Putin stated to a meeting of Belarusian allies that an anti-Russian Nazi sentiment building among the youth in Ukraine made armed confrontation with the country inevitable. The Russian head commented further that Moscow was left with no choice and that he believes the decision he made was the right one and that Russia will ultimately achieve its military objectives. The meeting with President Lukashenko of Belarus, following a staunch vow to always stand by Russia's side, was reportedly orchestrated by the two nations to consolidate their power and military might. For YPN News, I'm Larry McGee. Katan Jeff, back to you.
Well, as we see Russia and Belarus there strengthening their military ties, we're also going to talk about other countries that are strengthening their ties as this war in Ukraine continues. Well, Russia has increased its bombing campaign in Ukraine since Ukraine sunk one of its key warships. Now, the city of Kiev is among the targets, and after a missile strike there, rescue teams were sent out to extinguish flames and tend to injured civilians. Now, President Vladimir Zelensky recently recognized Ukrainian soldiers who have been fighting on the front line.
Zelensky also called for the U.S. to enforce an oil embargo against Russia and continue to supply Ukraine with more weapons. Currently, there are $800 million in weapons on their way to Ukraine. And because the U.S. is lending this aid to Ukraine, it prompted Russian President Vladimir Putin to write a formal diplomatic note to the White House, warning President Biden and his administration there could be, quote, unpredictable consequences, end quote, for these actions. And I think that Putin's made it pretty clear to the world, including the United States, but, to the whole world, that they will use nuclear weapons if anyone intervenes in this war.
Well, since the Russian invasion began 52 days ago, the United States has sent more than $2.5 billion in military aid to the Ukrainian government. But this last shipment will include for the first time heavy artillery, as well as more Javelin anti-tank missiles. And of course, Katan, that's as you were saying there, with the U.S. supplying even more now, that's where Putin has taken his pretty hard stances. Don't try us. We will use the nuclear weapons if we have to.
That's right. Well, President Joe Biden commented on the aid, saying, quote, "We're continuing to supply Ukraine with the weapons, resources they need to defend their country. We won't be able to advertise every single piece of equipment we give because our allies and partners are supplying to Ukraine through us. But advanced weapons and ammunition are flowing in every single day," end quote.
Well, the Ukrainian president has been hosting meetings with several allies, including a surprise visit from Prime Minister Boris Johnson. When asked if President Biden would make the trip, also, the president commented saying he's ready. But the White House press secretary, Jan Psaki, had to clarify the president's statement, saying he is ready. He's ready for anything. The man likes fast cars and aviators. He's ready to go to Ukraine. We are not sending the president to Ukraine, she concluded. So although he's saying he's ready, they're not saying he's going to go.
That's right. Well, the director of U.S. intelligence services has said that the threat of Russia launching a nuclear attack on Ukraine is very real and must be seriously considered. Russia has also threatened Finland and Sweden if they were to join NATO by saying they would deploy nuclear and hypersonic weapons into the heart of Europe. U.S. State Department spokesperson Ned Price said the two countries becoming NATO members would only promote stability on the European continent. He also said NATO is meant to defend and fortify and would not be a threat to anyone who is not attacking NATO.
Well, Finland and Sweden are considering joining the U.S.-led military alliance. Now, Russian chairman of the Security Council, Dmitry Medvedev, said if Sweden and Finland choose to join NATO, Russia would be forced to strengthen its land, naval, and air forces in the Baltic Sea, where Russia has its Kaliningrad enclave sandwiched between Poland and Lithuania.
Well, Mr. Medvedev also said he hopes both countries would come to their senses or face living with hypersonic and nuclear missiles very close to home. He said there could be no more talk of a nuclear-free Baltic.
And Katan, if you remember when the war in Ukraine first started, everyone was afraid to get involved, but now we see these other countries, U.S. being one big one there, supplying Ukraine with the weapons that they need, and now Sweden, Finland, they're saying they're going to join. So you can see Russia taking their tough stance, saying that the nuclear weapons, if we have to use them, we're going to, as all these other countries now are starting to join in and lend more support than they did in the beginning to Ukraine.
Yeah, so I'm sure from the point of view of Russia, it feels like they're continuously being backed into a corner. And we know that when you back anyone, or particularly animals, they call Russia the bear, and they made the statement, Russia's a teddy bear now, but if pushed hard enough, she could become that grizzly bear and lash out and attack. And of course, the attack in this case is not going to be of some weary camper. It's going to be an attack against other nations. And many millions of people are going to suffer the consequence of a nuclear exchange between Russia, NATO, Russia, the United States, or whoever.
Well, if you want to find out more about these stories, contact the House of Yahweh. And when you do, don't forget to request your free copy of the monthly newsletter and Prophetic Word magazine. Here's how.
To contact the House of Yahweh, you can write them at the House of Yahweh, P.O. Box 2498, Abilene, Texas 79604. You can call them at 1-800-613-9494. Visit them on any of their websites by going to Yahweh.com, YisraelHawkins.com, and Yahweh'sBranch.com. You can also visit our website by going to YPNnews.com. For anyone who would like to email the House of Yahweh, you can email them at info@yahweh.com. And for all calls outside the United States, please dial the number on your screen. And don't forget the Israel Says and Ask Israel programs. You can find those by going to YisraelSays.com and AskYisrael.com.
Well, don't go anywhere. Up next is another exciting message from Yisrael Hawkins. From all of us here at YPN News, I'm Jeffrey Heimerman.
And I'm Katan Alexander.
Thanks for watching.